All right, so I'm going to continue with the second part of this essay, which is Jung's introduction to psychology and alchemy. And this is found in Murray Stein's Jung on Christianity. And it's going to be probably the second of three in on this particular chapter, which is a 30-page long introduction to Jung's text. And so it's talking about the relationship between psychology and Christianity, and that the purpose or the role of psychology is in some way to raise our sense for the value of the soul as conveying these inner experiences of God in the form of the God image, and that this can facilitate, can support, indeed enact the process of individuation, our way of developing toward a greater expression of our wholeness. And so, in this way, the soul has a religious function, and the idea that the supreme value resides in the soul, that's what's interesting to him about psychology. The idea is that we're cut off from these experiences of the God image, and we devalue the soul in consequence. Christian education hasn't worked to bring Christianity to Christianize the soul. It hasn't achieved that. So our soul is still deeply pagan and has archaic roots, and we see the consequences of the, in a way, repression of our inner life playing out in the world, not only in 1944 when this was originally published, but in the world today. So again, the soul has not been Christianized, and this is the proper task in some way of psychology. And so if it can, it's a science, it doesn't make metaphysical claims, but it can reveal the empirical foundations of religious experience. These foundations are accessible with psychology, which is its great significance. The fact that there are God images does not prove that God exists as such. And so science cannot avow the faith of belief, but the purpose of psychology, its profound value, is that it has an opening effect for our reason and for our feeling to approach the contents of what has heretofore been religious dogma. So it's a way to approach these ancient truths, let's say, and the fact of their natural and interior origin in a new way for modern people. And so then he goes on into, this is page 192 of 211. And so he feels that, then he talks about so he sort of, it's in a bit of a polemic. So he's talking about how psychology tends to get blamed for being objective in a certain way. And then he's sort of pushing back against that. So what he says is it not thinkable that when one refrains from setting oneself up as an arbiter mundi, an arbiter of the world, and deliberately renouncing all subjectivism, cherishes, on the contrary, the belief, for instance, that God has expressed himself in many languages and appeared in diverse forms, and that all these statements are true? Is it not thinkable, I say, that this too is a decision? And so it's really pointing to something which is profoundly inaccessible to us unless we kind of imagine it. It's like the idea that there are these diverse truths, religious truths, the idea that they can all be true, that really asks us to imagine a greater space within which all of those could be true, because they seem so contradictory at times, so tempting for us to believe in one of them rather than in more than one. And indeed, it may be psychologically necessary for us to enculturate ourselves within the context of one original revelation. But that doesn't preclude the possibility that other religious truths are also true, in the same way that the necessity for me to speak English does not mean that French is not also a perfectly valid language to be using. And so he pushes back on the objection that, like, because the Christian objection, traditional objection would be, How is it possible for these contradictory statements from different religions to be true at the same time? And then the question is, well, how can one equal three? So the question of the Trinity. How can a mother be a virgin? And so on. And so multiple revelations can be true, just as the Trinity can be true. The fact of paradox is native to religion. The truth is that all religious statements, they contain logical contradictions and assertions that are impossible in principle. And that this fact is the very essence of religious assertion. It's pointing to the non-dual core of religious truth. And so the choice to notice and believe in the value of this plurality of revelation is in a way a decision, even if we commit ourselves to operating for ourselves or personally within one tradition. Religious assertion requires this paradox, which is why paradox is so highly valuable. As he says, hence a religion, where he says, oddly enough, the paradox is one of our most valuable spiritual possessions, while uniformity of meaning is a sign of weakness. Hence, a religion becomes inwardly impoverished when it loses or waters down its paradoxes. But their multiplication enriches, because only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. So again, he feels that when we define things, when we qualify in terms that are too specific, that this is a one-sided way of describing the world. And that makes it unsuited to express that which is ultimately and fundamentally incomprehensible or beyond us, greater than us. So he then goes on that there's something about the truth that's about paradox here, that it's actually quite dangerous. Paradox is dangerous, despite what we were just saying. And he feels that this is because of our, quote, spiritual weakness. He says, the inordinate number of spiritual weaklings makes paradoxes dangerous. So long as the paradox remains unexamined and is taken for granted as a customary part of life, it's harmless enough. But when it occurs to an insufficiently cultivated mind to make the paradoxical nature of some tenet of faith, quote, the object of its lubrications, as earnest as they are impotent, it is not long before such a one will break out into iconoclastic and scornful laughter, pointing to the manifest absurdity of the mystery. So there's a way that when we're spiritually undeveloped, we can fall into not appreciating the value of paradox. So there's a way that when we're cut off from the source of religiosity, we can fall into pointing out the absurdity of paradox. It's true that it is absurd, but if we get a sense, if we have a sense, if we understand why that's required, then we're not so mocking. So we haven't really, since the age of enlightenment, quote unquote, we cannot endure paradox. So there's a way that we're too small. That's what he means by spiritually weak. We cannot hold within us the contradiction of paradox, and so we can't appreciate its profound value. And then he says, a new task then arises to lift this still undeveloped mind step by step to a higher level and to increase the number of persons who have at least some inkling of the scope of paradoxical truth. So this is the great task of the modern condition, is to restore our sense for the sacred, that we've been cut off from the truth. And so the role of psychology in that aim is to restore our reason toward spirituality. It's where he says, Quote, the man who is stricken in this way cannot estimate the extent of his spiritual loss because he has never experienced the sacred images as his inmost possession and has never realized their kinship with his own psychic structure. But it is just this indispensable knowledge that the psychology of the unconscious can give him. And its scientific objectivity is of the greatest value here. So there's a way that I would say that it's not that psychology can exactly, in empirical terms, convey Gnostic experience itself, but it can lead the way, it can point the way there by revealing and pointing to the empirical reality of the dynamics of what he calls the unconscious. And so he says that there's something important here about the objectivity of psychology as a science, he would say. And so he feels that if psychology were bound to a certain creed, then it wouldn't allow the unconscious of the individual to play freely. So he feels that that free kind of play, serious play, which I would call, is the kind of basic condition for the production of archetypes. So it's the fact that these unconscious dynamics, these archetypal contents, the fact that they arise spontaneously is part of what makes them convincing. So there's a way that psychology should not be about convincing anyone of a certain dogma or creed, but about facilitating natural play, free play with archetypal contents. That playful attitude, which is non-dogmatic in its essence, is required for archetypal work. It's a precondition of that work. As he says, if the theologian really believes in the almighty power of God on the one hand, and in the validity of dogma on the other, why then does he not trust God to speak in the soul? Why this fear of psychology? Or is, in complete contradiction to dogma, is the soul itself only a hell from which only demons gibber? Even if this were really so, it would not be any the less convincing, for as we all know, the horrified perception of the reality of evil has led to at least as many conversions as the experience of good. Anyway, so we'll move on here. So we're talking about the role of psychology in facilitating archetypal work, which is in its essence non-dogmatic, involving serious play, free play, and spontaneity. And so he feels that these archetypes they're naturally occurring. So, quote, the archetypes of the unconscious can be shown empirically to be the equivalents of religious dogma. So it gives us access to the depths of dogmatic faith, faith that religion that we've only conceived in dogmatic terms. And so these naturally occurring archetypes are interpreted in many different ways according to time, place, and milieu. So in the West, this archetype is quite filled out or understood as the dogmatic figure of Christ, whereas in the East, it's interpreted as the quote Purusha or the Atman or the Buddha and so on. These are different, in a way, personifications, or you could say representations, interpretations of what Jung feels is the same underlying psychic reality. As he says, the religious point of view understands the imprint or the archetype as the working of an imprinter, namely God, whereas the scientific point of view understands it as the symbol of an unknown and incomprehensible content. So there's a way that from the scientific point of view, these symbols that whether it's Christ as a symbol of the self, or these other kinds of symbols from around the world, they point to something which is inherently unknowable or incomprehensible. It can't be comprehended in a way which is encompassing. It can't be, it's not something God is, or what the equivalent to God is not something that can be fully known. And hence psychology tries to examine such images objectively. Yep. So what he's saying is that he uses the word typos, which is in some way equivalent to the image here. It's the image or the imprint. Yeah, typos, the imprint or the archetype. So if, for example, the typos, if the imprint, this archetypal image that we receive from the depths of the unconscious, if this agreed in every detail with the dogmatic figure of Christ, and if it contained no determinant that went beyond that figure, then we would be bound to regard the typos as at least a faithful copy of the dogmatic figure and to name it accordingly. The typos would then coincide with Christ. But as experience shows, this is not the case, seeing that the unconscious, like the allegories employed by the church fathers, produces countless other determinants that are not explicitly contained in the dogmatic formula. That is to say, non-Christian figures, such as those mentioned above, are included in the typos. So this is what this is pointing out. What he's pointing to is the fact, the empirical fact, that the reality of the unconscious images that represent what Jung calls the self, or what we could call God, they are not limited to the conceptions of, for example, Christ that we find in dogma. They have a broader basis. So the unconscious naturally produces these figures which are not limited to the Christian dogma or to Christian images. And he says, for this reason, I found myself obliged to give the corresponding archetype the psychological name of the self. A term, on the one hand, definite enough to convey the essence of human wholeness, and on the other hand, indefinite enough to express the indescribable and indeterminable nature of this wholeness. So he uses the self as a psychological description of the sort of multifaceted nature, natural reality that is produced by the unconscious, that has sort of definite and indefinite aspects. It's, again, beyond all polarity. So the term self can convey a sense of the wholeness that self seems to represent or point to, lead to. But it also, the term self indicates the indefinite, the indescribable, the indeterminable, the indeterminability. And so what he claims is that archetypes are actually by nature indefinite. As he says, it's because archetypes are all by nature indefinite, all cultural representations are partial. So there's a way that the paradoxical qualities of the term, the self, these are a reflection of the fact that wholeness consists partly in the conscious man and partly in the unconscious man. Wholeness is comprised of both conscious and unconscious. But the thing is that when we understand this self as encompassing the whole of conscious and unconscious, well, the unconscious itself, the unconscious is not definable. We cannot define the unconscious, and we can't indicate the boundaries of the unconscious. And hence there is this aspect of the self which is indefinable, unlimited in a certain way. As he says, hence its scientific usage In its scientific usage, the term self, it refers neither to Christ nor to the Buddha, but to the totality of these figures that are its equivalent. And each of these figures is a symbol of the self. So the term self in Jungian theory refers to that totality and includes the totality of the symbols of the figures that are the equivalent of the self. They're symbols of the self. Those who are irritated by this objectivity should reflect that science is quite impossible without it. Consequently, by denying psychology the right to objectivity, they are making an untimely attempt to extinguish the life light of a science. So he feels that he's well within his rights to stick to what he considers to be the empirical basis of his choice of terminology. And so for the argument, in the argument that we've just given, which are kind of basics of Jungian thought, really, this is sort of why the term of the self is central in psychology, at least in Jung's conception of psychology, right? And so because of this, in a way, this makes psychology opposed to theology, in a way, because the whole point of psychology, as we were just describing, is that it points to the self. As in, for psychology, the religious figures point to the self, whereas for theology, the self would point to theology's own central figure. So, in other words, theology might take the psychological self as an allegory of Christ. So, in a way, they can get into opposition in that way. He makes the further claim that Christ and the Buddha are especially faithful figures of the self. So there's a way that they're the most highly differentiated and developed symbols of the self. And we see that from the scope and substance of the pronouncements made about them. And that they empirically they agree with the psychological phenomenology of the self in an unusually high degree, although they don't include all aspects of the archetype. So he goes on describing these qualities of the self a little bit more. So it's really important for us to try and grasp this central archetype. Again, it's kind of equivalent of the God term in psychology, but it's conceived empirically. So we were talking about it combines it transcends the opposites, right? And so it includes conscious and unconscious, and because the unconscious is in a way unlimited or indeterminable, it also includes these qualities. But paradoxically, it also includes the quality of definiteness or definite. It has a definite nature, and even the quality of uniqueness, since these are true of the conscious side of the personality. So it's very complex here because it's very paradoxical, right? How can something include both unlimited and indeterminability and also being definite and unique? But it in fact does, as an empirical reality, it does include this. And he feels that for this reason, that this is why there are certain religions which are able to be founded on historical personages, like Christianity and Buddhism and Islam, because the self has this definite and unique qualities of uniqueness. It's possible for historical people to be a symbol of the self. As he says, the inclusion in a religion of a unique human personality, especially when conjoined to an indeterminable divine nature, is consistent with the absolute individuality of the self, which combines uniqueness with eternity and the individual with the universal. he goes on a little bit here that the self is a union of opposites par excellence, and this is where it differs essentially from the Christ symbol. He feels that the Christ's androgyny is the highest concession that the church made to the problem of opposites. But the concession that they couldn't make is that, quote, the opposition between light and good on the one hand, and darkness and evil on the other, is left in a state of open conflict, since Christ simply represents the good, and his counterpart, the devil, evil. This opposition is the real world problem, which at present is still unresolved. The self, however, is absolutely paradoxical, in that it represents in every respect thesis and antithesis, and at the same time synthesis. Okay, so he feels that the self and Christ are in a way not equal, and the reason he feels that is that on empirical grounds, Christ, conceived of as the perfect man, manifestly did not integrate his shadow, his dark side, the Antichrist, within him. And so Jung feels that this points to he feels that he feels that Christ is a symbol of the self, but not in a way a complete expression of the self, because of the partiality of his representation. Okay, a little bit more here. Yeah, he says, once the exploration of the unconscious has led the conscious mind to an experience of the archetype, the individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature. And this confrontation, in turn, leads to the possibility of a direct experience of light and darkness, of Christ and the devil. Experience of the opposites has nothing whatsoever to do with intellectual insight or with empathy. It's more what we would call fate. Such an experience can convince one person of the truth of Christ, another of the truth of the Buddha, to the exclusion of all other evidence. We see that corroborated, for example, in modern psychedelic research. Some people come out saying God is real. Some people say God is not real. It's more about the transformative power. So he's pointing out here that human nature is inherently contradictory. There are so many contradictions in human nature, and that is reflective of the reality of the self, according to Jung. And it's in fact possible for us to experience this deep split that Christianity has saddled us with. And so this kind of experience of the opposites is possible, it's available to us, but it's also extremely rare. It's a rare person that experiences such a split deep within them in a conscious way. And it often comes in an unbidden way. It's not exactly something that we seek out voluntarily. And I can definitely attest to that. So he says, without the experience of the opposites, there's no experience of wholeness, and hence no inner approach to the sacred figures. Okay, so what he's talking about here is that when we deeply feel this conflict of the opposites within us, that this is in a way a precondition for the revelation of wholeness. So there's a way that the self arises in the form of these archetypal images, and it does so as a way of healing that conflict that we feel. So these images or revelations arising through the soul, they come about as a result of being stuck in that conflict of opposites. So there's a way that he feels that without experiencing that conflict of opposites, there's no way for us to approach what he calls the sacred figures. So the experience of the opposites is that which is needed for wholeness. He says, for this reason, Christianity rightly insists on sinfulness and original sin, with the obvious intent of opening up the abyss of universal opposition in every individual, at least from the outside. So if we understand the importance of experiencing this conflict between opposites within us, so as to experience the revelation of the quote unquote sacred figures, the archetype of the self, then how can we experience that? Because as we said, it's sort of rare and seemingly comes unbidden. Well, the point is that he feels that the purpose of the doctrine of original sin was actually to evoke this conflict within us. So he says, yeah, sinfulness and original sin are intended to open the conflict of opposites, but there's a way that it does that from the outside. And the problem is that when someone has a even moderately developed intellect, then that dogma is simply no longer believed. And on top of that, it's thought to be absurd. So we just say, no, we don't have original sin is bullshit, essentially. So this kind of an intellect he claims to be one-sided and sort of it gets stuck at the absurdity of the mystery. So it's an intellect which is again quite incapable of enduring paradox or opposition. It's quote unquote quite incapable of enduring the suffering that such attention involves. And so the problem with this doctrine is that um, even though it's supposed to constellate the opposites in this way, but it's dogmatic and it's quite absurd and it's oppressive in a certain way coming from the outside. It's not creative. It's not oriented to working with the inner man. It's a way of imposing those opposites upon him. Hence, it often also leads to psychic damage, to genuine harm, because it imposes, uh, deep shame, guilt, and so on, self-loathing. This is a real problem and sends a lot of people to quote unquote the consulting room of the doctor. Bearing with the inner conflict of the opposites is extremely difficult. As he says, whatever one may think of this phenomenon, one thing is certain, that apart from anything else, it holds within it a large humanity and an understanding of human weakness, which compensate for the world's unbearable antinomies. This is the doctrine of original sin. It seems to, I mean, there's deep truth to it. So there's a way that he feels that because of the imposing and demanding nature of original sin, it's like there's a contrast here. There's the conflict, and the conflict is that um, insight into this problem of opposites is really crucial. It's a real imperative. But in practice, there's very few people who can actually stand and bear with that inner conflict. And the confessional, the church, knows this very well, this conflict. And so in reaction, we have the doctrine of, quote, moral probabilism. And so again, the purpose of original sin is to expose us and to evoke the sense of the problem of opposites. But then it's also very unbearable to sit with that problem of opposites. So what's the response to that? And the response is the doctrine of moral probabilism. And I'm going to describe that now. And it's a rather long description, and it says, Zokler defines it as the name generally given to that way of thinking, which is content to answer scientific questions with a greater or lesser degree of probability. The moral probabilism, which we're concerned with, consists in the principle that acts of ethical self-determination are to be guided not by conscience, but according to what is probably right, according to whatever has been recommended by any representative or doctrinal authority. Yeah, so there's a way that What he's describing here is the way that the church can sort of give people an excuse. It can sort of say, "Oh, it's okay for you to be like this. It's a We're guided by whatever is recommended by any representative or doctrinal authority." So they sort of give people a lot of free passes. It's okay to love God just before your death, or it's okay to love Him only for a few years. This kind of thing. And so this is a kind of compensation for the crushing weight of sin, the difficulty of bearing with the problem of opposites, conceived in terms of original sin. And so that's why he says that this insistence on original sin on the one hand, and this concession to probabilism on the other hand, that this is a kind of paradox, in fact, and that paradox is implicit in the nature of original sin. I'm hoping that's clear. What I mean is that we get beset with this notion of original sin in the doctrine that's supposed to evoke this sense of the conflict of opposites within us, to expose us to the reality of the wholeness of God, let's say. But it's very demanding, crushing, heavy weight to bear. And moral probabilism arises as a response to this, that we um, sort of get a lot of it, get excused a lot from really bearing with this conflict. And this is a paradox which is implicit in the nature of the doctrine of original sin. And then he says that this seems to be, for the psychologist, a necessary consequence of the Christian problem of opposites. So it makes sort of logical, psychological sense for this consequence to arise. As he says, for in the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. As he says, the reality of evil and its incompatibility with good cleave the opposites asunder and lead inexorably to the crucifixion and suspension of everything that lives. Since, quote, the soul is by nature Christian, this result is bound to come as infallibly as it did in the life of Jesus. We all have to be crucified with Christ, i.e., suspended in a moral suffering equivalent to veritable crucifixion. In practice, this is only possible up to a point, and apart from that is so unbearable and inimical to life that the ordinary human being can afford to get into such a state only occasionally, in fact, as seldom as possible. For how could he remain ordinary in the face of such suffering? A more or less probabilistic attitude to the problem of evil is therefore unavoidable. So what he's saying here is that all of us are crucified between these opposites. And this derives from the fact that the soul is by nature Christian, because Christian doctrine and Christ were unable to resolve this problem in the form of good and evil. Well, we all bear with this as well. Practically, that condition is unbearable, and hence this moral probabilism exists, re the problem of evil. So he says, the confessional proceeds like life itself, which successfully struggles against being engulfed in an irreconcilable contradiction. So as a doctrine, it's whole and it's divided just like life. So again, we have these concessions. On the one hand, the doctrine of original sin trying to expose us to the opposites, and moral probabilism as a way of coping with the unbearable reality. Then he says, and I'll just finish after this. He says, note that at the same time, the conflict remains in full force. And that is once more consistent with the antinomial character of the self, which is itself both conflict and unity. So again, there's a paradoxical quality here. We're talking about something which is inherently conflictual and inherently unified at the same time. Quote, Christianity has made the antinomy of good and evil into a world problem, and by formulating the conflict dogmatically, raised it to an absolute principle. Into this as yet unresolved conflict, the Christian is cast as a protagonist of good, a fellow player in the world drama. Understood in its deepest sense, being Christ's follower involves a suffering that is unendurable to the great majority of mankind. Consequently, the example of Christ is in reality followed either with reservation or not at all. And the pastoral practice of the church even finds itself obliged to lighten the yoke of Christ. This means a pretty considerable reduction in the severity and harshness of the conflict, and hence, in practice, a relativism of good and evil. Okay, so what he's saying here is that this conflict between good and evil, this antinomy, has been absolutized and raised to an extraordinary degree, and that we are cast into a role by that tradition, the role of the protagonist, the role of good, and that this unresolved conflict is played out in the world drama, on the world stage. In reality, we find it impossible to follow Christ because of his perfection. And because I would say we lack the emotional space to hold the inner conflict as a result of the atrophied and undeveloped nature of the soul. And hence, in practice, because of the unbearable nature of the crucifixion between the pair of opposites, because we cannot bear that in practice, the conflict gets watered down, and we both don't experience God, and we get this relativism of good and evil, stuck in that dual condition. And the imitation of Christ becomes far harder to fulfill. Quote, good is equivalent to the unconditional imitation of Christ, and evil is its hindrance. Okay, so I'll just do a little bit more here, and I'll stop on the following page, which is when it starts to get a little bit more about gnosis. So as he says, as a result of this, although one must concede a number of cardinal Christian virtues to the probabilist endeavor, one must still not overlook the fact that it obviates much of the suffering involved in the imitation of Christ, and that the conflict of good and evil is thus robbed of its harshness and toned down to tolerable proportions. This brings about an approach to the psychic archetype of the self, where even these opposites seem to be united. Though, as I say, it differs from the Christian symbolism, which leaves the conflict open. For the latter, the Christian symbolism, there is a rift running through the world. Light wars against night, and the upper against the lower. The two are not one, as they are in the psychic archetype. But even though religious dogma may condemn the idea of two being one, religious practice does, as we've seen, allow the natural psychological symbol of the self, at one with itself, an approximate means of expression. So what he's saying is that when the conflict between good and evil is robbed of its harshness, when it's brought down to being tolerable, it means that the experience of the self actually becomes available in that way. So we gain access to the experience of the self when we don't experience God by unifying good and evil. He's also pointing out that in religious practice, religious practice is central to the dogma, and it denies that two are one, obviously. Two cannot be one in the dogma. But religious practice, on the other hand, it does allow for the natural expression, for the natural psychological symbol of the self, at one with itself, an approximate means of expression. So through religious practice, the self is able to express. He then points out that, this is the final bit that I'll stop with. On the other hand, dogma insists that three are one, while denying that four are one. So the Trinity, three is one, and one is three. But four is not one. We can't have that. So The dogma, the Christian dogma, it denies that two are one because we're constellated between the opposites. There's good and evil. Christ is good. Antichrist is evil. They're not the same. It also denies that four is one, while it affirms the unity of both one and three. And so then he says, since olden times, not only in the West, but also in China, uneven numbers have been regarded as masculine and even numbers as feminine. The Trinity is therefore a decidedly masculine deity, of which the androgyny of Christ and the special position and veneration accorded to the Mother of God are not the real equivalent. So what he's saying is that there's the dogmatic conception of the monotheistic and, in a sense, patriarchal Christian Trinity is imbalanced toward the masculine. And what we see is that this ultimately ends up being compensated with alchemy. And the other esoteric traditions such as Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and so on. So because only a partial aspect of God is included in the dogmatic notion, there is this compensation, which is an undercurrent running through all of Western history. And so what we see this in one of the central axioms of Maria, namely Maria Prophetessa. One becomes two, two becomes three, and from out of the third comes the one as the fourth. One becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth. And that's the kind of one of the central axioms of alchemy. And it points to the reality of religious experience. Including the reality of duality becoming unity. And so there's a way that this axiom, it describes a way out of the partial and dogmatized nature of our conception of the deity. It describes a way, I would say, forwards and into it's a kind of recipe. It's kind of like a Zen koan. That what this is pointing to is that it opened up for me in the form of an experience. And so this is a symbol of that experience. And yeah, there's a way that I feel that understanding what this quote from Maria Prophetessa means is a way to allow this Christian symbolism to develop to a fuller expression of itself and to be less one-sidedly masculine and Trinitarian and more whole in a certain way that corresponds with what Jung is talking about. So I'm going to leave that here and come back to the rest of the essay, which talks about the significance of alchemy in the light of all of this, although it goes back to the myth of Tiamat and Marduk first. There's a lot of good stuff in the third part, so it's definitely the most interesting 10 pages. Okay, until then.